Outlines are in the back if you don't have one, the back pew. This is mostly the same as to what I handed out at the end of class last week, though there are some small differences. So get a new outline if you haven't done so. Let's pray, and then I'll introduce again what we're going to look at today. Our God, we do thank you for your grace and your kindness towards us. We thank you for your continued work in our lives, that what you begin, you bring to completion. I do pray that you would be honored in all of our reflection this morning. Some of what we look at is difficult even for myself to grasp and to attempt to teach. So I do pray that you would help us to think well and carefully, and to even come away with a deep conviction of the truth and who you are as our triune God, and even a confidence as we do speak to others of our faith. Help us, we pray, for we ask in Christ's name. Amen. I'm not going to go through all of the first number of lines on your outline. Not all of it is as immediately pertinent to what we'll look at, but take some time on your own to look at how I've stated some things regarding the doctrine of the Trinity. The main thing that we're going to make use of this morning as we think about how to approach God's triunity in the context of apologetics is just a very basic summary of what it is that we believe in one God who exists in three persons. And the two key things that we're going to, that we'll make use of or want to apply is understanding that there is a single divine essence. There's only one. There's one God. Not just that the Father, Son, and Spirit are identical gods, but they are the same God. There's only one God. Single divine essence, yet truly three distinct persons. The Father's not the Son, the Son's not the Spirit, etc. The purpose for what I hope you get from our discussion this morning is not quite that you would have a kind of argument that you've heard me speak and teach, and that you are able to remember and then regurgitate to somebody else. Some of us may be able to do that, but I'm not hoping, just so you know, I'm not hoping that you're going to take whatever we talk about today and then simply repeat it to someone else. What I'm hoping we can do this morning, and this will make more sense as we get through, is that you grow in an understanding and a confidence of how deeply unbelievers depend upon God's triunity at its deepest level. So that when you are talking to someone, and let's say the doctrine of the Trinity comes up, what happens in your mind? You're like, oh no, how am I going to talk about this, right? We're nervous to even talk about God's triunity amongst believers because we're scared we're going to say the wrong thing, or we're going to be put into the category of a heretic, because oftentimes we end up saying something that verges into heresy if we're not careful. So if we can't even talk about it amongst believers, how can we even dream of dealing with it amongst unbelievers is kind of the concern. Now, so I'm not trying to give you an argument that you can use necessarily, though perhaps you might, but I am wanting you to have a confidence that unbelievers depend deeply upon God's triunity in all of the basic things that they do, all of us do, so that you can at least have the sense that when the topic of God's triunity comes up, you're not breaking new ground. It is simply the world that everybody lives in because they depend upon their Creator, who is himself triune, one God in three persons, Father, Son, and Spirit. So that will hopefully make more sense as we get into this. Repeat a couple things, again, just by way of introduction from last week. These are not meant to be Trinitarian analogies, nor are they technically proofs of the Trinity, as though if everyone would recognize these things, they should be able to infer God's triunity apart from the Scriptures or apart from special revelation. What we're trying to say is actually how God's triunity illumines certain things about creation and makes sense of our experience in it. Okay, enough by way of introduction. First main thing, the triune creator creates in a triune way. The triune creator creates in a triune way. Turn to John 1 with me if you would. I'm not going to spend too much time here. But this is a text, if you're familiar with it, often comes up in discussions of God's triunity, as we understand from the Scriptures. And what's fascinating is that it represents John's reflection on the work of creation, in particular Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It's a reflection on that. One of the things that's significant is that we first see the triune God in the very first verse of the Bible. It's not just a new thing in the New Testament. The clarity is certainly given later. I think that is important. The clarity with which we understand God as triune comes later, though God is still triune from the beginning. And that's some of what John discerns, reflecting back on the work of creation, in particular, God's speaking, and then things coming to be. So we won't turn there, but recall in Genesis 1 the prominence of the Word in the act of creation. Not only the Word as something that's written, but the Word in particular is that which is spoken. God spoke, and then it was so. Turn to Psalm 33:6, if you would. And I want you to notice what is put in parallel to the Word. Psalm 33:6. By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and by the breath of his mouth all their host. So notice what is parallel to word and breath here. To word is breath. And I apologize. I need to look something up to make sure I have this right. What you have in this text is translated breath, is the word that's translated in other contexts, spirit. So I think there's something here in seeing something coordinated between the Word on one hand and the breath of God or the Spirit of God on the other. And the way in which Hebrew poetry often works, when there's a synonymous parallelism, where you have two lines put in parallel to one another, more or less saying the same thing. They're not a bare repetition one of another, but it's something along these lines where you have A is so, the first line is so. What's more, B is so. Here's one statement, and then the next statement, it repeats it, but in a way that carries it forward. So there's something similar here, where you speak about the word of the Lord, by which the heavens were made. And then what's more, you have the breath or the spirit by which the word is even carried through to its fulfillment in what is actually things being made. I'm skipping a number of things here in terms of how we would establish this a little bit more deeply, just for the sake of time. But I think the Scriptures do bear out at least this kind of an understanding of the act of creation, in that there is God, you have this on your outline, I believe, who speaks the word, and the word is carried by the breath of God or the Spirit. It's probably one of the places where the Scriptures get closest to, I'd be cautious to say this too strongly, but get closest to a kind of analogy or understanding of the Trinity. But the main point, especially from John 1, reflecting on Genesis 1, is that what lies back of God's work of creation and speaking is, in fact, God's triune existence. so that the work of creation itself displays and manifests God's Trinitarian nature. We could sort of reframe this in a slightly different way, seeing something similar in the work of creation or the work, God's providence over history, where there is the decree, the work of creation itself, and then that which is created, all of which depend upon God himself, and certainly all three persons are involved in each. But God himself, and the one who decrees, in the work of creation, and then that which is actually created, yet you still understand a real distinction between each of those things. The decree is not itself the work of creation, nor is the act of creation the same thing as the thing that is created. Distinct things, each of which depending upon God to make it what it is, and in some fashion the work of creation and creation itself depending upon God as triune, one God in three persons. So how do we live in dependence upon this? The next part of your outline, we live in dependence upon God creating in a triune way. In other words, God's work of creation lies back of all that we do within creation. Three main ways where we would see this. The first is simply in terms of how it is that we think about anything in creation at all. Remember, there is the decree of God, the work of creation, and then the thing that is made. What's involved in us even perceiving and understanding in any sense or knowing anything that is in creation, it's somewhat reversed, where there is the object itself that has been made. You got something, okay, tangible piece of creation. There is the perceiving subject, whereas God is active in creating. We are passive and receptive in terms of that which God has made. And then there is the concept that is formed in our own mind as to what this thing is. And you can distinguish those things, that the concept is not the same thing as the object itself. Thinking about a water bottle does not make a water bottle. But the idea is that the concept that is in my mind actually has some kind of a connection, or at least is identical to the water bottle itself in terms of its attributes. Otherwise, if I have in my mind the concept of an elephant, I'm not accurately perceiving the water bottle that's in my hand. So notice how, again, the way one theologian has described this is God is creatively constructive. We are recreatively reconstructive. We think God's thoughts after him. Decree, work of creation, the thing that is made. Here is the object of creation. We perceive and a concept in our mind. Again, noting the commonality between all three of those, yet still true distinction. I'll go through two others, and then we'll look at this in a little bit more detail. That's in terms of thinking and thought. The second is thinking, is considering the act of speech or communication. This is much more similar to what we've seen in as John reflects on Genesis 1 with God, the Word, and the breath that carries the Word. There is the idea in the one who speaks, the word that is actually spoken, similar to what I'm doing now, and then the understanding in you as the hearer insofar as those words are understood, so that there is an idea in my mind encapsulated in the word that I speak and then re-impressed upon your own mind as those who hear and understand. And then the third place where we could see this is in terms of any kind of action or doing of anything in this world. On a small scale, you think in terms of intention, the act itself and the effect that it has, or on a broader scale, a kind of plan, the execution of a plan, and then the goal obtained. The argument or the kind of the approach I'm going to take on all three of these things, we'll look at only two of them, as if we have time. We may be able to do one, depending on how we do, is that these are basic ways that everyone lives in this world. Everyone thinks in some fashion along these lines. Everyone acts or does things in this world along these lines, or you speak, depending upon these things. And what's actually going on is that these things are undergirded by God's triunity in terms of an understanding of the general unity of of all three of these, as well as a genuine distinction between each one, as we have laid out here. So let's see how this works out as it relates to speaking, speech or communication, using the threefold ideas of idea, as it is in the mind of the speaker, the word spoken, and the understanding received in those who hear. Anytime there's an act of communication, it depends upon and presumes a kind of basic unity between all three, the idea in my mind, the word spoken, that which is understood, to assume that an idea is able to faithfully be represented in verbal speech, as well as effectively reframed and received in your own mind, but also an assumption that there's a genuine distinction between those things. For me to think is not the same thing as for you to think something, or the same thing as for me to have spoken something. So understanding the basic unity between these three, as well as the distinction, makes communication both worthwhile and necessary. Without it, there's no conveying or fellowship and understanding. So let's work through this a bit and see a little bit more how communication depends upon a basic unity between all three of these, the idea in my mind, the word that I speak, and the understanding you receive. What happens if there's a breakdown between the idea that is in your mind and the word that you would speak? For example, I'm filled. Is my wife here yet? Is Kelly here? Okay. Well, I'm not going to embarrass her. But let's say I'm filled with love and admiration for my wife. And it's like, I say, words cannot capture the sense that I have. So let me just start here. Oh no, I can't even pronounce these. Pedestal, pedestrian, pedestrianism, pediatric, pediatrician, pediatrics, pedicab, right? Okay, I may have some sense in my mind what it is that I'm desiring to communicate. But if the words have no relation whatsoever to what is in me, there is no kind of identity or commonality, what's even the point of trying to listen, right? It's useless and fruitless. It's a waste of time. In fact, I may have just wasted 15 seconds of your life. It doesn't make any sense. There's no point. If you're going to be involved in any kind of communication, it presumes that it's possible and that there is a basic unity between the idea in my mind and that which I speak. We feel this sometimes if someone is throwing around ideas or words that we're not even sure they understand what they're saying. They've just heard it before. And we start to think, I don't really have the sense that I'm even listening to you here, so why even waste my time? There's no connection between the words that they speak and what is in their mind. Similarly, if there is a breakdown between the idea in my mind and the words that I speak on one hand, and the understanding that you receive on the other, again, it seems like a sort of fruitless exercise. If someone speaks in such technical vocabulary that you know they understand what they're saying, but they're words that you have no idea what they mean, it's like, okay, what's the point here? You're speaking to the wrong audience. I can't track with you. Why waste my time listening to actually what is impossible for me to receive? There's a connection between the idea in my mind, the words that I speak, but for you, there's no connection between the words spoken and the understanding that you could receive. So why waste your time? Similar, when there is a language barrier at times. I speak English, and I'm in an environment where nobody else speaks English. I may know very well what I'm preaching, but it's actually pointless for me to preach when everyone else does not speak English. Yet still I'm saying all of these great lofty words, but there's no point because nobody can grasp it or understand it. we depend upon a basic unity between the idea, the words spoken, and the understanding that you would receive in order to make communication even worthwhile in the first place. Now, not only do we depend upon a basic unity between those three aspects of communication, we also depend upon a basic and genuine distinction between the idea in my mind, the word that's spoken, and the understanding that you receive. What if we fail to appreciate the distinction between an idea in our own minds and the words that are spoken? If we don't appreciate the real distinction, we may think it's not worth saying something. Because the idea is in my mind, why should I have to say it? And then suddenly I expect you to know whatever's in my mind, but I've not said it. Have you ever had that frustration? You're laughing. Have we ever had that frustration before? Right? Because we fail to recognize there's a difference between thinking something and actually speaking it. Recognize that difference. Otherwise, there's no effective communication. What if we fail to appreciate the distinction between the word that's spoken and the understanding that is to be received in the hearer? Well, we may say something, let's say again in English, in a context where someone does not understand English, and they don't understand what we're saying, and what do? We get frustrated and angry. What's wrong with you that you don't understand the language I'm speaking? When, of course, the deficiency is in ourselves. We're the ones who's speaking, and we do not know how to communicate with someone, the person before us. We assume that the deficiency is in the person who is unable to understand, perhaps because, for whatever reason, we assume they are unwilling or unintelligent. We speak slowly or louder, perhaps, when in fact is a failure on our part to recognize the difference between speaking on one hand and understanding received on the other. So, summarizing here, for communication to be worthwhile and effective, we presume a basic continuity and unity between idea, word, and understanding, as well as recognize a genuine distinction between those things. Both of those are necessary. Otherwise, communication is ineffective, frustrating, and fruitless. Now, how might we turn this, a little bit more clearly in an apologetic kind of direction? Well, you'll notice in your outline, I'm borrowing language from some of our earlier discussions in talking about, on one hand, a functional dependence upon the truth, and on the other, exposing the falsehood of what is false. So let's take this first part and seeing how that there is a functional dependence upon God's triunity in the act of communication that anyone takes part in. If you are going to open your mouth and speak and bother to consider how it is that you can formulate words in a way that encapsulate what's in your mind and able to be understood by the person before you, you have to presume that there is a basic unity between the idea in your mind, the word spoken, and the understanding that you've received. The question is, why would you assume such a thing? Experience shows that oftentimes we are not able to actually capture in words the things that are in our minds. Have you ever had that kind of frustration where you struggle to actually find words to say? Very often in experience, we recognize that words fail to adequately and fully convey all that is in us. We often say one thing as well, and perhaps we accurately represent what's in our mind, but we say one thing and someone else understands something completely different. We recognize that. So in our experience, we know that this doesn't really match up, right? The idea in my mind, the word that I speak, and the understanding you receive. We have to assume that there is a basic unity, but the question is why? On what basis? When we open our mouths and speak, given that our experience tells us that there is often not a unity between those things, what we are doing is we are presuming or depending upon a source of unity greater than any of us have ever experienced. we presume and depend upon a kind of unity that is actually outside of the communication process itself, a kind of unity that undergirds it. That's what I'm saying as a dependence upon God's triunity. The same thing holds in terms of presuming a basic distinction between the idea in our minds, the word spoken, and the understanding that is received. We presume that there is a kind of distinction between those that does not destroy the unity. They're not just wholly, completely different things. I don't have an idea of a water bottle in my mind. When I open my mouth, suddenly I say the word elephant, and then you understand tree, right? We understand a distinction between those three in a way that still preserves the unity, but the question is, well, why? Oftentimes when my words inadequately represent my own ideas, you're still able to fill in the gaps, aren't you? This is kind of an ordinary way of communicating. And you can supplement perhaps what I say or fill in the gaps with what I don't say, or other people can contribute words to what I've spoken, and you gain greater understanding. In fact, sometimes you can have a better understanding of what I'm trying to say even than I do. You ever had that before? Someone's trying to teach you something, and you come away with a better grasp and a deeper grasp than even the person who was teaching. That's possible. Because the distinction between these does not so rigidly depend upon the distinction that is isolated to the communicative act itself. It depends upon a distinction external to the act of communicating. This is what I'm calling a functional dependence upon God's triunity to undergird the whole communication process. The unity upon which we depend is God's unity. The distinction upon which we depend is that between the three persons of the Godhead, Father, Son, and Spirit. This is not the same thing as saying anyone who speaks has an understanding of God's triunity or a self-conscious acknowledgement of it. But even if it's ignored, it is still dependent upon in all that we do. Last section on this, exposing the falsehood of what is false. I'm going to show the falsehood of what is involved as someone seeks to, the falsehood of refusing dependence upon God's triunity. What happens if in the act of communicating, someone tries to depend upon a unity that is not external to the act of communication, or depends upon a distinction between the idea, word, and understanding that is not external to the act of communication, but is actually narrowly isolated to the act of speaking itself? What starts to happen? If we absolutize the communication process, here's what happens in terms of the unity. If the unity is found only in our communicating, the words that we speak and then the understanding that's received, then the word that I speak and understanding that you receive is wholly and completely limited by what I understand. You're not going to get anything more than what I understand. So the perfectionists among us perhaps will spend all of our time trying to perfect our ideas and never get around to actually opening our mouths. It has to be perfected in our mind, because that's the limitation of what is going to be able to be communicated and able to be understood. It has to be perfect before you speak. Or there is the assumption that if the unity is contained within the act of communicating itself, then I assume that you will never be able to have a better understanding of what I'm saying than I do. You can't grasp these concepts better than myself, is the idea. You could never have a better sense of what I'm trying to say than myself. Another way to approach this in terms of if we absolutize our own speaking and assume that the unity is kind of dependent upon what we are saying ourselves rather than external to it in God, then the unity depends upon our fully embodying our ideas in the words that we speak. If you're going to understand something, I need to make sure that the ideas that I have not only are fully formulated in my mind, but are fully and completely embodied in the words that I say in your hearing. So then we have the situation of someone speaking in such copious and technical ways to precisely and comprehensively encapsulate every thought and idea that is in their mind, and always having the sense of never having fully said enough because they've not yet fully and faithfully said all that is in their minds. And then an audience is what? Lost or bored or perhaps patronized. It's like we get the idea already, right? It's the sense that no one else is able to fill in the gaps. There's again, if we depend upon the unity in terms of what we say, then that results. Last way that we see this in terms of depending upon the unity in the act of creation is apart from outside of the act of speaking itself. We can depend so heavily upon in what we say, ensuring that your understanding matches precisely what we've spoken and the idea that's in our own minds. Then you adopt a policy of perhaps coercing understanding and coercing belief. That if you do not think something precisely in the way that I do, it must be because you've not yet understood it. In fact, if you would not say something precisely in the way that I would say it, then you're not listening to what I'm saying. Again, you adopt a kind of coercive approach to the extent that you believe or understand something differently than the way that I would. You've not yet grasped it. It's a dependence upon a unity in the act of communicating itself. What if we, in closing, do this in terms of depending upon the distinction? It's perhaps a little bit more difficult, but depending upon the distinction in the act of communicating itself, and say that the only kind of distinction between idea, word, and understanding that will maintain the unity between these is in the act of me speaking and communicating. You start then to micromanage the whole process of communication. The only words that would then be trusted to accurately convey these ideas are that which we speak, not that which comes from the outside or any other place. And the only kind of understanding that accurately grasps the ideas in our own minds and the words that we would speak have to come from ourselves. And if there's any kind of independent formulation or words that are incorporated, it's assumed to be inaccurate or unfaithful. There's a kind of tyrannical domineering of the process of communication itself. The point, again, is to see how in the act of opening our mouths, something so simple as what we all do. We have an idea, we speak, we want others to understand. What are we doing, even in something so simple as that? We're depending upon God's triunity, a basic unity in God and a genuine distinction between the three persons. Let me pause for thoughts and questions. I probably won't move on to the second part of this. We'll see if we have time at the end, because I want to get on to some other things. But there's a very similar kind of approach you can take in terms of acting or doing something, any kind of action that we would take in terms of plan, the execution of a plan, and the goal that you seek to obtain, something very similar in terms of the shape of the approach as we had with communication and speaking. Thoughts? Make sense? How have I done in conveying understanding? Yes, Kelly. She said this to me this week, by the way, when I was giving her a preview of what we were going to talk about today. Analogies. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Right. So, yeah. So, This is where I think it's important that what we're not doing is trying to give you an analogy for understanding what God's triunity is. These are not the principles upon which God's triunity are built, nor is this intended to try to describe for you or to reveal what God's triunity is. But we're actually wanting to flip it around, okay? It is, to use the technical philosophical language, what we're describing here is neither the ontological basis nor the epistemological basis for God's triunity. This is not the reality that God's triunity is based upon, nor is it the way that you come to know God's triunity. But completely reverse that. Where does this structuring of even thinking and speaking and interacting in this world come from? It comes from the fact that God is triune. It's the triune God who has created. So we see this. And it is God's triunity that actually can shine a light on understanding how is it that we even operate and act in this world. You act this way, presuming a unity and a distinction between these things. Why? On what basis? Well, because you cannot help but live and move and have your being in the triune God creator who has made you in the world in which you live. So there is a kind of, to sort of make up a word, trinitaneity to creation. Or some theologians have said, though I might understand this slightly different than they would, but vestiges of the Trinity in creation. Where you see that in structuring, and not contained in creation itself, but creation depending upon the triune God in his triunity. So it would be wrong to use this to say this is where God's triunity is revealed. No, it's not. But it is dependent upon God being triune in order for this to even be what it is. Does that help a little bit? Okay, yes, Dwight. Yeah, we're never fully going to comprehend God's triunity, but it can be truly revealed and made known. And this is kind of like, you don't have to understand the laws of physics and gravity and how it is that there is a kind of a force. Get all technical, get physics technical. What's called a normal force pushing up that counteracts the force of gravity pulling you down. You don't have to know any of that. But guess what? It still works. I'm still here, and you're depending upon it. There's something similar to that, where you're wanting to actually show how here are things that you depend upon in actually a much deeper way than even the force of gravity and opposing forces of the ground pushing you up and holding you up. But we depend upon it nonetheless, because not only are we talking about this is the world we live in, but this is the God who has created and continues, as the creator, continues also to sustain his creation. Other thoughts? Yes? Yeah. Right. Yeah. So. Right. So Yeah. Uh-huh. So to use your example as to you being a particular person, distinct from me and Adam and Tricia, okay, but still human being, just as much as we all are, there can be something helpful in understanding what we mean. The difference when it comes to talking about God is that we're not saying the Son is God just as much as the Father is God and the Spirit is God, but the Father is the same God that the Son is, that the Spirit is. So the way in which you would use that kind of language, the kind of analogy, would talk about the distinction of persons, but then it would be as though someone were humanity itself. Right? The whole category is not something that God falls under, and Father, Son, and Spirit are all under the broader category of God. But the category is what the Father is, the Son, and the Spirit is. So you can say, we mean that Father, Son, and Spirit are just as distinct as these three hymnals are in terms of person. The person is just as distinct. But when we talk about the Father, Son, and Spirit being one God, we mean they are one just as much as this is one and the same single hymnal. I'm not talking about three hymnals. So you can use analogies to describe what you mean when you make any particular statement, but I think when we run into trouble is when we use an analogy to try to encapsulate the whole of what we're describing. So you end up, again, with all sorts of heresies. Again, very briefly, the egg. You heard this? Shell, yolk, egg white, three, all an egg, right? What's the problem with that? Well, then you end up having something like, well, the Father, Son, and Spirit are all parts of God. But they're only the whole God when you put them together. That's heretical. What about the idea of water, right? Being ice, liquid, gas, and existing in those three kind of forms all at the same time, right? Well, you either have something like modalism, where you have a molecule that can exist in one form, and then another form, and then another form, where you have one God who every now and then is like the Father, and then sometimes he sort of switches states and he's the Son, or switches states and is the Spirit. Or you really just have tritheism, where you have water, liquid, ice, and gas all existing at the same time, but guess what? They're not the same water molecules. So again, you run into problems if you try to press that, but you can use it to talk about what you mean. When we say Father, Son, and Spirit are distinct persons, we mean they are just as distinct as I am not Dwight. That's what we mean. But they are the same, one God, in the same sense that we mean I am me. There's one me, right? That's what we mean by unity. But anyways, I'll stop there, because that's not quite the point of what we're talking about. But any other thoughts? Okay, I'm going to skip the second part of this. You can probably fill in the gaps, or I could tell you some other time, in terms of following the same kind of process with something like a plan, execution of a plan, and the goal obtained. But I want to make some comments briefly on what I don't have much of an outline for you, but it's this last thing. Why not just tack it on to the end, right? Some thoughts on election and reprobation. So, the reason why I have this linked together with looking at the Trinity is that, again, I want to give you a brief sort of approach to how to understand something like this, how to deal with this perhaps this one you might be able to use a little bit more readily in conversation with others. It's not intended quite to be an analogy for understanding God's decree of election and reprobation, nor is it intended to say if people would just open their eyes and consider the way that things are in the world, then they should be able to infer or deduce that a decree of election and reprobation exists, or more broadly, the idea that God is sovereign over every meticulous detail, even while there is genuine moral responsibility on the part of human beings. As a side note, the question of God's sovereignty and moral responsibility on one hand is slightly different from the question of God's decree of election and reprobation. But you're going to see a lot of similar ideas in what we go through briefly now. When you read this, let me just read this very briefly. In Confession of Faith, and you come across the decree of election, it strikes people oftentimes as unfair or illogical, and not even worth even considering. That's what happens when I look at it in a different... Oh, here we go. All right, I'm not going to be able to find it now, so I'm going to skip that. But basically, when you understand that from before the foundation of the world, God has decreed for himself an elect people, the number of which does not increase or decrease, will infallibly come to be saved and redeemed and enjoy the presence of his blessing and glory. And with that, understanding that God has decreed as well a number of people who would be eternally condemned to the fires of hell, the numbers of which will not increase or decrease, but will infallibly come to be in the last day. It seems a very strange kind of thing that you would say that, but also take seriously the genuine moral choices and actions that we make in this world. How can those two things come together? And the main point that I want to point out today is that as strange as this way of thinking seems to be, there is a very similar way that all of us think about things all the time. And it basically comes down to this. Hindsight is 20/20. You ever considered that? Hindsight is 20/20. Months ago, when Russia was moving its troops around and doing all sorts of things, preparing to invade Ukraine, there were all sorts of opinions as to whether or not what people thought was about to take place was able to be diverted. And even all sorts of speculation as to whether or not something was about to happen. You probably remember that. It was in the news. Everyone was thinking about it, saying, well, you should have known. Other people saying, no, it's not going to happen. It can still be diverted, whatever. Okay, many opinions as to what is going on. Now, after the fact, as you look back and consider it, you can see clearly what, in fact, did take place. From the vantage point of the present, there is much that is unknown as we consider what will come next. And as much as you may be certain or feel like you are certain about what's happening, there is a broad swath of actual possibilities as what, in fact, could be. But from after the fact, as you look back, you can see much more clearly than when you look back to see what had been there. So, again, summarizing hindsight is 20/20. The end is the clearest lens through which to see something. Just an interesting observation. The end is the clearest lens through which to see. This is a phenomenon that we make use of endlessly. Anybody like to read biographies at all? Anybody? Yeah? Some biographies? Now, when you pick up a biography, oftentimes it's of a figure whom you already know something about. Not always, but oftentimes you know something about someone. And of course, that actually colors how it is that you read the biography and understand something of their life. If you read a biography of Isaac Newton and you hear about some of the ways that he was just kind of an oddball sort of child, and nobody really liked him, and he had this terrible home life and issues with his dad, it kind of becomes interesting as you sort of look at this and try to understand what was sort of coming and where things were going in his life. It frames your understanding of the significance of what you're reading about. This is not just any person that you're learning about. It's Isaac Newton. okay? Every biography depends upon this fact that you are able to take the end and kind of the conclusion of something and actually see clearly something of how things had led up to that point. Now, it would be poor writing if you are recounting someone's life and you write it as though whatever takes place at the end point in the life of Isaac Newton was so inevitable and obvious. It was not obvious as it was going through his life, right? The reason for that, kind of the analogy, or kind of the kind of corollary to that, the reason why the ends are not so obviously determined and fatalistically determined as things proceed is that the principle of determination, in actuality, is not in creation. That's fatalism. The principle of determination is in God, not creation. That's an important distinction. So it's bad history or bad biography when the outcome seems to be only this kind of inevitable outflow of things. In actuality, many things could have happened as it's seen from that vantage point. At the same time, it is equally bad history or the writing of a biography that makes every single detail in the life of a person or in the course of history, if it makes every single detail just as significant as another. When you write something, the whole point is you are selective in what you write because you're wanting to actually illumine the way that things actually took place and happened. What enables you to actually illumine the way things happen in a way that you are not merely importing your own ideas? Well, it's this fact that there is a sense in which the end properly illumines what had come before. There is something true in what is made known that could not have been known at the time of its transpiring, but after the fact you can reflect and see clearly. Again, think about your own life as you go through things, how uncertain and unable you were to predict where your life is now. But you can look back and you can tell someone very clearly, I'll tell you exactly what happened in my life. There may not be everything that you understand, but how is it that from the end, you can look back, we sort of take it for granted, but you can look back and you can say clearly and debate about what actually happened in history versus what did not happen in history. There's a clarity in looking back that is not had looking forward. And we are not importing our own ideas, but actually illuminating what is there from the beginning, though, of course, only able to be seen after the fact. It is in the very fabric, the very ways that we think, and even engage in things like self-reflection or learning from our own mistakes or things along those lines, is because it's in the very fabric of existence. We depend upon this. It's grounded in the fabric of God's own decree, in which the end does properly illumine the beginning and is able to shed light on it. We'll have to close. Well, I'll stop. Any comments or thoughts, questions at that point? Make some sense, perhaps a little bit? All right, let's pray. God, I do thank you for your kindness to us. We thank you for the gospel. We do thank you for the work of salvation that demonstrates your own sovereignty and your grace to save sinners like us. I do pray that you help us as we do desire to think well about the world that you have made, how it is that your character and your goodness and your glory is displayed in it, and cause us to be good and faithful servants as we do speak of the hope that's been given to us in Christ Jesus. We do ask these things in his name. Amen.